Hey, everybody, and welcome to the show. I am Liz, and I am joining you as usual from Central Virginia and the unceded ancestral lands of the Monica Nation. And I'm so glad that you are with me today. And before we jump in, I want to share with you a couple of reminders. First, my book, Home to Her, Walking the Transformative Path of the Sacred Feminine, is available now from Womancraft Publishing. This book reflects my own exploration of sacred feminine wisdom, both from a historical perspective, as well as my lived experiences, and also the insights I've received from the many guests who have joined me on this show. So if you're interested, I would love for you to support my publisher, which is a small woman-owned business, Womancraft Publishing, by buying from them directly, or support your local bookstore and order it there, or order it on bookshop.org, which shares their proceeds with local and independent bookstores. And if you've read it and enjoyed it, I would be so grateful if you'd consider leaving a review for it on Amazon or Goodreads, because that's how the word gets out about these things. And it helps other people find this work. And also, if you've read it and you want to share your reflections with me, please do. The reason I wrote the book, at least in part, is I really wanted to be in conversation with people on this subject. So please feel free to reach out. I love hearing from you. And you can find me on Instagram at Home to Her. I also have a Facebook group called Home to Her as well. And you are welcome to jump in there and join the conversation about the sacred feminine that's happening right now. We have about 8,000 members now from all over the world, which is kind of cool. And then finally, if you're listening to the show and you like it, I would be so grateful for your reviews there too. iTunes reviews in particular help other people find the show. And given that this is a homegrown podcast on a niche subject, I can tell you that your reviews can and do make a huge difference. I am officially going into my 4th year of hosting the show, and I am quite proud to say that Home to Her is now in the top 2.5% of all podcasts globally, which is pretty amazing, especially because I don't have a sponsor or an advertising budget, which means this growth has all been slow and sweet and powered by people like you who are listening and sharing it with others. So thank you. And if you haven't yet written a review, but you feel called to do so, I would be ever grateful if you did. All right, that's enough with that. Let's get on with the show. So I say this every time. I'm really excited about my guest today. And I'm really excited about my guest today. I came across her work years ago when she was the guest on another wonderful podcast called On Being, which, if you aren't familiar with it, it kind of set a high bar for me, especially when I was thinking about starting a podcast. I find the host to just be really thoughtful, and introspective and just deeply committed to honoring her guest work. And so, anyways, to find a guest that's been on that show, I was like, whoa, this is a big deal. And then I came across her work again with a beautiful book of poetry that came out in 2022. And so one thing, if you've been listening to this show for a while, you might have picked up on the fact that the longer I do this, the more and more interested I am in understanding the sacred feminine from as many different perspectives, personal experiences, and faith traditions as possible. I think when I started this, I was kind of like had this push towards unity, like we all need to be seeing and feeling and experiencing the same thing, maybe because I didn't want to feel alone on this journey. And that is important, but I think what's even more interesting to me now is holding the multiplicity of the many ways in which people approach the sacred feminine and how they understand her. And it isn't about us all having the same experience. It's about holding the space for all those different experiences and what we can learn from each other. And so one area that I have been curious about for a while now that I've only explored just a little bit on this show is the sacred feminine in Judaism and how it shows up there. And so I know that my guest today has a lot to share with us on this subject, as well as lots of other things. So let me go ahead and introduce her to you now. Joy Ladin's experience of being poetically mentored by the Shekhinah. I tried, Joy. I can't get the so you can do it for us. The Shekhinah resulted in the completion of a book-length sequence, Shekhinah Speaks, published by Selva Oscura in spring 2022. Joy has also published 9 other books of poetry, including recent National Jewish Book Award winner, The Book of Anna, and 2 Lambda Literary Award finalists, Impersonation and Transmigration, as well as 2 works of creative nonfiction. National Jewish Book Award finalist Through the Door of Life, A Jewish Journey Between Genders, and Lambda Literary and Triangle Award finalist The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective, the first book-length work of Jewish trans theology. Her writing has been recognized with the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a Fulbright Scholarship, an American Council of Learned Societies Research Fellowship. And I should have checked with you on how to pronounce this, so I'll do that as soon as I finish, Joy. And Hadassah Brandeis, did I get that? Okay. Hadassah Brandeis Institute Research Fellowship, among other honors. Episodes of her online conversation series containing multitudes are available at jewishlive.org/multitudes, and her writing is available at joyladin.wordpress.com. If you didn't get all that, I'm going to put it in the show notes, so don't you worry. And Joy, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor, and it's just such a privilege to have you with me.
Thank you. I was so happy when I got your email reaching out, and I had not heard that you were doing this podcast, and I was not aware until connecting with you that there is this larger community. I think community is overused, but there really are a lot of people who are interested in the divine feminine and thinking about divine human relationships from that perspective. And that's exciting to me. You know, I always start by feeling completely like an oddball and idiosyncratic and, you know, the only one who's going to care about whatever it is I'm doing. And this is, you know, home to her also feels a little bit like home for me. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. And I just love what you just said, because that pretty much in a nutshell is why I started the show. I'm like, I got to find somebody. There's got to be people out there that want to be in conversation or, that want to hear about this subject. So if I start doing this podcast, will they show up and will I find the guest? And here I am going into the fourth year of the show. And yes, people are interested. And I don't know. I had this idea that maybe I'd run out of guests after the first year, and that has so not been the case. I think the list gets ever longer, actually. So we are not alone. It's wonderful.
Yay.
Yeah. Well, I would love to. And so, just for your listeners' sakes, Joy and I had a little kind of pre-podcast conversation last week, which I knew is it's a good sign when I feel like it's starting to turn into the interview, and I'm like, oh wait, we got to save all this for the recording. But one of the things that I told her is that my first question is always about people's spiritual background, and that is something that I did kind of learn from this On Being podcast, which I also like. But the reason I ask it is it's usually it's an interesting entry point to me into our understanding of the sacred feminine, because we either started with some awareness of that or we didn't, and then that aspect showed up later. Regardless, I'd love to hear a little bit about your spiritual background and how you feel like that shaped you as a child, and then maybe informed where you headed as an adult.
Thank you. That is a great place to start. And I don't know, I've talked, as you know, from the interview with On Being, I've talked a lot about my spiritual autobiography, but I haven't talked about it really in quite this context.
Mm.
So I'm expecting to learn. When I was growing up, even as a very small child, I had two intertwined experiences of being different in ways that felt to me like they were dangerous in my family and in my culture. I grew up in a middle class, white Jewish home. It was still, the Holocaust was still really not that long ago. So my father had been able to buy a house in a red-lined neighborhood. So still no Black people, but Jews were allowed to buy there. So we grew up in a house that was much bigger than our income. And my family was not religious in it. I'm not sure that if any of them were religious other than I was. It was that kind of thing. It was really like a secular, assimilated idea of Jewish identity. Although my mother was very proud of being Jewish and different in those ways, for her it was really kind of ethnically rooted.
Mm.
And that was important for me, but it didn't help inform my understanding of God or religion. So I grew up with a sense of God as a living presence who was right there with me. And I didn't have anybody to teach me that I was wrong because my household wasn't part of um, an institutionalized form of Judaism as a religion. And so, on the one hand, it was lonely to be the only person that I could see who had any sense that God was there. And on the other hand, I didn't grow up being taught that, God isn't there for people like you. In my case, people like me included not only lonely and weird children, but also um, I was trans. I didn't have that word then, but I knew from a very early age that my sense of female gender identification, my sense that in some way that I still can't explain, I really was a girl,
Mm.
even though I was born male and raised male and living male. It didn't make any sense to me then, but still within the framework of binary gender, it still doesn't make any sense. Um, but that was my other secret. So in the secular context, saying, "Oh, I feel God's presence. God and I are talking with one another. You know,
Mm.
God listens to me." That kind of marks you as crazy. At
Mm.
best, I would say. Um, when I was in college, I was upgraded to just stupid
Mm.
for saying things like that.
Yeah.
It was okay. My ego was so inflated that I survived. It might have even been good for me. Um, but the trans thing, I also thought I was the only one of my kind to have this weird relation to gender, and I knew that because I was living in a world where to be human was to be either male or female, in the sense they're the sex of your body and your gender, your sense of who you are, they align with one another. One determines the other. There wasn't even a separate word for gender actually when I was a very young child. Um, I knew that that would not only make me seem crazy, but in some way I felt like it meant that I wasn't really human.
Mm.
And so those two things intertwined together. And I think that on the one hand, the social isolation, I felt like I was always hiding and lying in terms of my gender presentation. I knew my life depended on people taking me as a boy. And so even though that hurt me to present myself that way, that was absolutely what I was committed to doing. But that meant that nobody knew who I was. When I said, I want blah, blah, blah to my mother, which I'm sure I did as interminably as any other child, um, I knew that my mother didn't know what I meant by I. That's a kind of loneliness. And I
Wow.
felt like I was lying when I would say anything to other people in a certain kind of way because I was always presenting myself in terms of who they thought I was, but who I knew myself not to be. So that kind of intense isolation meant that I was not distracted from God's presence. And I think that I think it is common for kids to have a sense of what is beyond the human. I think that that's a normal human capacity and proclivity. Different cultures shape it in different ways. My culture wasn't really shaping it at all, so I was free to fill in the blanks there. So to me, what was beyond the human was a divine presence who was not human. Really, what God I knew was beyond human, did not have a gender, did not have a body, was not visible, but was there, but no one could see God. God loved people, but people were not aware that God was there, so it was unreciprocated. To me, that made God and I have a lot in common
Wow.
because as a trans kid, and again, healthy ego there, but as a trans kid, that was the way that I felt. I don't fit into humanity. I don't have a face or a body that makes me visible or understandable to the people around me. I love people. I did. I was, severely traumatized and, not what I would, later consider a good person, if you can even say that about small children. But I had some problems, but I did love people. And I wanted to be attached just the way other children do. And knowing that I wasn't who other people thought I was, and I had to keep it that way, made it very hard to do that. So when I was talking to God, I was talking to the one person who actually knew what I meant when I said I.
Mm.
I felt understood. I felt seen. I felt like it just was not when I was a very young child. At a certain point, felt like God and I had this side deal. Judaism is based on the idea of a covenant between God and the Jewish people. Very strange idea of entering into a legal agreement with,
Mm.
God. But that's a founding idea. But I felt like I wasn't really part of the Jewish people in the sense that if they knew who I was, no actual Jewish people would want to include me. I felt like I really had a personal covenant with God, which was, you see me, you bear witness to me. And so it's my job to see and bear witness to you. You see me as real. My sense of myself is real to you. And so your presence, I need to bear witness to the reality of it to me. And that relationship sustained me. I can't imagine getting through. I mean, it was still not such a great childhood. There were, suicide attempts, um, but I also never felt like I was completely alone. And I always had a model of a way of being real, of being a person, and yet not fitting into human categories. And when I read the Hebrew Bible, we were not a Bible reading family, and we certainly didn't have a New Testament, but because I had this religious sense, I was drawn. Judaism was the nearest religion, and there was some, my mother wanted to make sure that we were part of the temple and everything. Anyway, unlike many children who have better social lives, I really loved going to religious services, and I ate that up, and I would start to read the Hebrew Bible, and I saw a portrayal of God there that really resonated with my experience of God. I saw a God who keeps trying, really, with limited success and often tragic results, to have relationships with people who can't perceive or understand or even remember that God is there. And
Mm.
God gets very angry about this, and genocidally angry. But I kind of liked that. I know
Mm.
that's supposed to be a big theological problem of theodicy and Jewish God. Actually, God is more vulnerable than angry. But what I liked about it was I knew the anger that comes from being there, and nobody sees you, nobody knows you're there, nobody has a clue of how to really engage you in relationship when that's why you're there. You want to be with them.
Mm.
But I turned that into these suicidal feelings. Whereas God had, to me, an enviable ability to express anger outward in a healthy way. It didn't bother me that people died by thousands, particularly, because I identified with God in this scenario. Yeah, that's right. People should know you're there.
Mm.
Um, so fortunately,
Wow.
God never gets suicidally depressed. Imagine what a Bible would be like with a God who responded the way I was responding. Um,
Wow.
so as you can see, this relationship with God starts from what I still think as an adult is a true perception that the divine, however we conceive it, is beyond human categories like gender. I mean, I didn't have the word gender or concept of gender, but it was clear to me that if you don't have a body, you can't be male or female in the way that my culture was defining it. It just didn't make any sense. And that was reassuring to me because like I said, it meant I could be a person, even though not fitting into gender. But many, many years later, so I kept having a relationship with God, and I grew up, and I'm, writing poetry and still in the closet. I'm still living as a man. And I had come across references to the Shekhinah, who is the name for the feminine divine, as you're calling it, or um, I think what Jewish mystical tradition would call the female or feminine aspect of the divine. Um, but it's not really developed in the liturgy. And wasn't a scholar, so I didn't come across the sources. But I read enough footnotes and stuff to get the general idea that the Shekhinah was the name for the aspect of God that is not out there, transcending and judging and making floods and all this kind of stuff. The Shekhinah is the aspect of God that is right here with each of us and is gendered feminine.
Mm.
And when I started writing about her, it was as a metaphor that I could safely use to express my sense of female gender identification. It really wasn't about my relationship with God, which was outside gender, right?
Mm.
It was, but I thought, yeah, the thing about the Shekhinah, she's always there. She never goes away no matter what's going on. And that was the thing about my female gender identification. It was never good for me to have it. It was never a plus or an advantage, but it would never go away. And it was also, the Shekhinah is associated with images like fountains and gardens and ascent, bell sounds, the sound of wings rushing, wedding canopy. These are all images that start to collect around the Shekhinah as Jewish tradition develops her. And that was the way, for me, my female gender identification, I couldn't live it, but that was where the good stuff of life was. I knew that I couldn't access it without tapping into that. And so it felt like the Shekhinah was something I could write about without anybody saying, oh, you're coming out as transgender. So I wrote a couple of poems that were like that. And so they were kind of pretend religious poems. And I felt bad about it because I was pretending to have this religious meditation when I knew I was actually meditating about something else. But that's the way it works when you make art in the closet. Blues musicians would do the same things. I think slaves would sing spirituals with these double meanings. You can't express how you really are feeling in an oppressive system. You use code that means one thing to you and people like you, and will read as something different to people who are oppressing you. So I did that for a long time and I had, I started living as myself. That kind of shifted my relationship with God in a number of ways. I also grew up, which I think was good for everybody. And I continued to be interested in theology. I continued to write about the Hebrew Bible and how Jewish identity intertwined with trans identity. But I wasn't writing about the Shekhinah. Because again, I'm a God doesn't have gender person. Until I was invited to speak at a symposium called She. There's a disembodied Judaism, something or other, at the University of Colorado Boulder. Is a very Boulder thing. Does this thing, and they were doing one on the Shekhinah. And so I thought, yeah, I'll dust off these old poems, but I should really write something new. And I started to do that, and I really loved those things. But I'd done so much theological thinking that afterward, when I went back to them, I was really unhappy with them because I thought, this is really like idolatry. This is me making a little puppet God who will say exactly what I think God should say in the way I think God should say it. This is not the Shekhinah, whatever the Shekhinah is. And I felt something I'd never felt before. I felt longing to hear what the Shekhinah would say. This was strange because I've always felt like, not that God talks to me the way God talks to Moses in the Bible or something like that, but when I'm talking with God or pouring out my heart to God, I don't feel that there's no response. I hear laughter. There's a lot of laughter. That's, always a mixed blessing, but, really like.
Is that supportive laughter, or you and your little problems laughter, or?
Absolutely. It's both
Yeah.
because it's, look at the way I'm seeing you. God is, when I talk to God, God's whatever God, however God responds, it's always try on how I see you. In other words, try to step outside your littleness where there's so much suffering
Mm,
and not lose yourself, but just enter into this largeness where you also exist.
mm,
And that, so that laughter is liberating. It is a little bit, maybe mean. It's not nice for the creator of the universe to laugh at creatures. But in another way, laughter dissolves boundaries. Laughter dissolves binaries. Laughter is an invitation to
mhm,
think in ways that are larger than we do. Sometimes there are other kinds of responses. So I never thought of myself as being frozen out by God in the way that some people do. Like Ingmar Bergman does these anguished early films about longing for God's voice and God's silence. It was not something I felt was a problem, but suddenly, as I looked at these poems that were travesties of what they were pretending to be, all of a sudden I felt a longing to hear what the Shekhinah would say. And by this point, I knew more about Jewish tradition, and I knew that the Shekhinah doesn't get to speak. So there's no examples of, the God in the Hebrew Bible gets to talk a lot. The male identified aspect of God, the transcendent, judgy God, gets to speak a lot in post biblical sources, rabbinic discussions and stuff. There are different kinds of imaginations of it. The Shekhinah is just imagined as a silent presence. And I knew enough to realize that that's because the Shekhinah in the Jewish tradition was I like to think of it as a product of a 1,000-year-long one night stand between the Jewish theological imagination and the gender binary.
mm,
So as Jewish theology got more and more invested in a transcendent, distant male God, it's really not the God you see in the Hebrew Bible. That's a retrospective projection. But as it got more invested in that, and that was important because remember, the Romans had destroyed everything. They'd, killed or exiled about 1 million people. They destroyed Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple. They made sure Jews would never go back to it. So you needed a God who was at a safe distance from human history and human suffering. But as the people who brought us Christianity know, they were among those Jews. The people who brought us Christianity were also Jews who lived through the Roman destruction,
yeah,
persecution. They knew that there is a longing for a God who really understands human life and human suffering. A God whose love not only transcends the human, but which we can recognize in our limited human ways. So by the time the rabbis get around to wrestling with this problem, Christianity has become quite a successful religion. I don't think Jews would have ever gone the incarnation route, but that was foreclosed by, you know, the the potential for that in Jewish tradition had already been exploited by people who created Christianity. Jews were already non-Christians and Christians were non-Jews. So what they did was they went back to and there have been some talk about this, but there's a verb in the Hebrew Bible. Again, God is not consistently gendered at all, but grammatically, God's almost always male, but not
yeah.
always. And one of the verbs that has a female gendering for God is the verb for dwell. When it says God dwells among the people of Israel, God dwells in the tabernacle, that is a female verb. It's shachen, shachanti,
Mm,
um, it's a feminine verb form. And the rabbis built that out into the concept of the Shekhinah, which is the aspect of God that dwells among people. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, it's not an individual thing, but it is, remember, one of the things that pisses God off in the Hebrew Bible is like people grumbling they don't like food. That's how close God is dwelling among the people.
mm,
I never think of God like getting upset if I say, I am so tired of hamburger, but that's basically what happens in the Hebrew Bible. So but they built this out into an idea of a Shekhinah who is a feminine aspect. And the way the gender binary works, male and female are mutually exclusive opposites. So if you want to know what the female is, it's the opposite and lesser of the qualities that are ascribed to the male. So masculine aspect of God talks and has power and acts, judges. The female aspect of God dwells with people, doesn't speak, but suffers what we suffer, dances at our weddings, rejoices is really with us in our each of our human feelings. And so this way of understanding God is not saying God is feminine, or even that, if you see God, you'll notice this pink side and this blue side, or anything like that, right? What it is it's using binary gender, which is structures our most intimate relationships. It's using it to imagine God in a way that helps us feel close to God, to help us feel that God understands us and is present with us. But that idea of God was also hampered by the misogyny that's built into the traditional forms of binary gender, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm coming to this and I'm like, yeah, if the Shekhinah is always there and always with each of us, really has a ground level view of each human being, I suddenly really wanted to know what she was saying. Because I knew that if the Shekhinah was divine, was really an aspect of God, she is not bound by gender binary limitations. She would look at the idea that being the feminine aspect, she has to be lesser and opposite. She would like, screw that. You
Mm.
know, I'm, I'm God. Just like, I'm God in the key of the feminine, but I'm God. So I had a hunger to hear God in a way that I'd never experienced it before. And so I didn't want to write poems that gave my idea of the Shekhinah, because I knew that I knew what my ideas were. They weren't the real thing. I wanted the real thing. I wanted to turn my poetry over in some way and allow the Shekhinah to speak through it. And I didn't even know what that meant at first, but I knew it meant I had to use words that weren't mine. And so I decided, with some prompting that I would say came from the Shekhinah, um, to build poems by taking words from two very different kinds of texts. One is from chapters of Isaiah, particularly late Isaiah, where there are great divine monologues. Um, so it's certified divine language, right? It's in the Bible. This is the way God talks. If you use those words, you're using words God uses. I don't have to figure that out. That's just a good thing. And but those words they're not gendered at all. And they're not immanent words particularly. So I needed to mix them with words from a different kind of source. And I thought this was a crazy idea. It wasn't my idea. But I reached for Cosmopolitan magazine articles. And when I was given that idea, I was like, this is crazy. But I'm only going to do it if, like, I can't just take a random Cosmo article and a random piece of Isaiah and do this. There has to be some connection between the texts. And what are the chances that there will be any connections between Cosmo articles and the book of Isaiah? Seems improbable to me. So I kind of told the Shekhinah, we'll do this as a test. I went to the website of Cosmo and I took one of my favorite late Isaiah quotes in the voice of God. God says, "Sing out, O barren one who has not given birth." And I typed barren into the Cosmo search bar. I thought, people don't use this word. This is going to show this won't work. And immediately what came up was an article called Why This Woman is Proud to Be Known as the Pageant Queen Without a Uterus. And I thought, oh my God. The Shekhinah is known as a queen. She does not have a uterus.
Mm.
I guess I have been shown that I was wrong. My skepticism was wrong. This can work. And so now I have to learn how to make it work. So I would just take words from each of these texts and mush them together until I started to hear a voice, and until that voice started to say things that I started to recognize. And there was a lot of learning that was required and a lot of tutoring, because the Shekhinah all I really knew about her was that she's really not human, but she
Mm.
really is with us and she knows everything. So how do you use human language to convey somebody who is outside time and space, but nonetheless with us in every moment that we're experiencing? How does a person like that talk? And what the heck do they say? So, yeah,
Mm.
that was my spiritual journey in relation to the Shekhinah, and I got some lessons which were great, like some glimpses of how she sees things.
Mm. I have so many questions. This is fascinating to me, and I think the combination of Isaiah with Cosmopolitan is is brilliance, just brilliance. And what it makes me think of is, well, why wouldn't she, if she is with us and among us, then why wouldn't she be dwelling among the pages of Cosmopolitan or anywhere else, right? But I have a question related to that, which is okay. Here's what I wrote down while you were talking.
But I would say yes. I just want to
Yeah.
say a big yes there, that even
Okay.
though our world is mostly, I would say, gendered secular, the world that most of us spend most of our time in, and secular by definition means we live it as though there's no divine presence.
Mm.
That does not mean that the divine is not present. And it does not mean that we can't recognize the divine presence through this world that is gendered secular.
Yes. Well, and that, so in my own research and just trying to understand how the goddess has shown up, sacred fit. Well, we don't have to use the term goddess, like, right? That's a loaded term, but how this apparently gendered aspect of God that shows up as feminine, how that's shown up in the past. And there's this idea that seems to come up repeatedly of eminence, and as opposed to transcendence, like you already you referred to this, right? So there's the okay. So I was raised in a conservative Christian household. So God's up here. He is removed from us. He didn't have anything to do with, like, he made us all, and now he's hanging out up here on a sky cloud, judging us for getting it wrong. And we need to get to church and pray, and feel guilty because he sent his son and we screwed up and didn't appreciate his son, and so he killed him, and that's really our fault. Sorry, Christians. That was kind of my interpretation. But as opposed to eminence, which is that the goddess, divine feminine, is not the maker. She is the earth. She is all the things. And so my question for you is, what I wrote down is, where do you end and God begins? Because if she dwells among us, does that mean she is also within you? Are you an aspect of her, or do you still see her as perhaps walking beside you and among us, but not? Does the dwelling apply to ourselves and our souls too?
That is such a fantastic question.
Mm.
So as I was as I was working on these poems, like I say, I did not have the theological thinking I'd done had not been in this genre, so I just didn't have the intellectual or really spiritual tools or elevation to do this. And one that's one of the questions, particularly because from the first, the Shekhinah seemed to, number one, be with each of us. I knew that all of the poems were talking to a you, and it was a singular you, but it was a you that she meant to represent each of us. Because she sees us from the inside out, she feels like she only needs one singular you. It'll apply equally to all of us. We just don't look that different from the inside out. And she wants us to know that she knows us. So her form of immanence, which is different than the immanence of being the earth, and there's a real absence of God as nature or goddess as nature in this book. It's just
Mm.
not there, but it's in many ancient traditions that include the divine feminine. It's
Mhm.
just that's not what the Shekhinah was on about in this. What she's saying is she wants to prove to each of us that she really is there, that she really does know us. She wants us to see how she sees us. She wants to invite us to see ourselves the way she sees us. her immanence, because it's not bounded by separate selves, and it's not bounded by time and space, is a form of transcendence. So the first binary that she melts is the transcendence immanence binary.
Mm.
And actually, I guess the first one that she melted was when she said, yeah, screw the idea that the male aspect of God gets goodies of divinity that I don't get, you know?
Mm.
We all, can't be divine without having power, without having a voice, without having all of the attitude, apparently. Um, so she's melting this immanence transcendence binary. But then I realized as she's talking about what she means, she wants us to know that she's there, that she really knows us, which I found scary. In fact, I didn't, as I was revising the poems, I was always looking to try to figure out how to get rid of the language that was just me pretending and get to the stuff that was really something that was beyond, that was the project. And I realized the only way to be sure was when I was starting to get scared. I would have to see myself as the you who's being spoken to. Everything that was being said would have to be at least true for me, or it couldn't be true for everybody anyway if it wasn't true for me, and it would have to scare me.
Mm.
And so she's scaring me, and then I'm realizing as the poems are, it's a specific thing that's scary. It scares me to be seen utterly and completely. It scares me to be known from the inside out. But the thing that scared me most of all was that she keeps saying, I see you completely. I know you utterly. And I love you because you are growing out of me and I'm growing out of you. My presence in the world is partly happening through you. Your presence in the world is my presence. Your life is my life. It's a way that I live. And so, when I'm loving you, I'm inviting you to see yourself as I see someone who I intended to exist when the world was made. I loved you long before you. And you can't be here without me. And because you're here, I'm here. And because I'm here, you're here. So she doesn't dissolve the distinction. She doesn't become and therefore you're just God and, we are all just oneness. Judaism doesn't do that because God, for a reason, on bad days, I can't understand it all. God in Judaism sees relationships as sacred. Relationships between human beings are sacred. That's where most of the commandments that God gives are about how human beings should relate to one another,
Mhm.
because those are seen as having direct bearing on the universe and on God's presence in it. But also, God really wants to talk and be with human beings. Remember that sense that I had as a kid. I love people. I want to be with them. So the Shekhinah is driven by, she doesn't want me to stop being and just dissolve into her divinity and even into her love. She wants me to be me, but to be me in a way that no longer is predicated on not being her. Be me in a way that is not, my life was really based on being unlovable. So I think that's true of a lot of people, but I think if you are different in ways that your society doesn't understand or doesn't like, it's especially hard to feel. Although my theory is that most human beings feel somewhat level. If people really knew who I was, they might not really love me.
Mhm.
But, the Shekhinah is more like Mr. Rogers, where, I like you the way you are. I don't want you to cease to be you. I want you to be you in a relationship with me where you know you are utterly seen and known and loved. And therefore, I want you to see yourself as, even as I'm the womb out of which you're emerging, I want you to understand that you're the womb through which I'm emerging. Because I don't get to live your life without you living your life.
Mhm.
I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does. Yes, it's fascinating to me. Yeah, and I've talked to a lot of people on this show over the last few years, and so my brain is kind of going through, like, for example, get like these little tendrils, again, multiplicities, right? And similarities, so, but there's little tendrils that in ways that I'm not going to accurately describe. So I'm just not even going to try, but like there are tendrils of it, for example, that remind me of things that I had a guest who's pretty deep into Hindu uh, spirituality, and just like the nature of Shakti and the idea of us being intertwined with divinity, and that divinity is, I don't know that she would say this, so this is my own interpretation, which I may have gotten wrong, but that the divinity is ever expanding, and that expansion includes through us. It is us, like that. So, right. We need each other, or we are the same and we need each other. Yes.
That's right. And I do think there are religious, spiritual paths that lead toward oneness, just leave all difference behind. And there are spiritual paths that delight in difference, that say difference doesn't have to be painful and tragic and make us feel like separation. Difference, I mean, I think the dance is one of Hinduism's great metaphors for human divine relationships and also divinity.
Yes. Yes.
And, dances really kind of suck if there's just one person in the universe.
That's true.
You
Yes. Well, and I have a question too about so we're talking about the Shekinah, and I'm sorry for my lack of the um
Hey, you could.
I
You just could.
I just did it, didn't I? That was okay. I'll have to practice that. But no, I'm wondering if is the she for Shekinah situational, meaning were we not where we are in this moment where for whatever reason the transcendent God has been
Mm,
expressed as male and he,
mm,
um, would we even need to put the she on Shekinah if that were not the case? Would she just be they, or a different aspect of God that has gotten um, lost, perhaps, and that we put the she on her because there's that correlation that we see,
mhm.
or cause, I guess, like causation, perhaps, of loss of the feminine principle or elevation of misogyny. Does that make sense? Did I?
Yeah,
Okay.
you asked the best questions. And I'm going to say yes and no. So I think that there is a way to come to the Shekhinah or to the divine feminine through the way of misogyny.
Hmm.
You say, well, my way of understanding myself is as a female person. My experiences are gendered female. My sense of existence, of what it means and what's important, these all come to me through embodiment and experience as a female person. And I feel locked out and estranged from ways of relating to God that assume that God is male, that only recognize and value male metaphors for God, male, male human experiences, like when we say God is king. What the heck are we talking about? What we're saying is, well, the head male is a good analogy for God. But we don't say God is queen because, well, the only reason is misogyny. We're not saying
Right.
God is also queen. If they're just both metaphors, God is neither queen nor king.
Right.
So the way of misogyny can create a real deep sense of spiritual wounding that doesn't, and if it doesn't kill off your longing for connection, one of the ways of healing and feeding that longing is by searching for and putting yourself in relation to the divine feminine, either by just saying, look, actually, my existence as a woman is sacred. And it's a source of ways of knowing the divine, right? My
Hmm.
experiences of being in the world as a woman, the ideas that surround womanhood, at least the good ones, maybe even some of the bad ones, maybe even my sense of vulnerability, because I think the divine to the extent that it depends on us to be witnessed and engaged with and voiced, is extremely vulnerable. And the patriarchal God is not allowed to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
with the exception of the occasional crucifixion. You know, um, however, our image of female is of constant vulnerability because of misogyny. So some of God, and this is something that Jewish feminist theologians are very clear about, is that whenever we get to a patriarchal God by excluding women from our definition of what it means to be human, our idea of what it means to be a fully human is male. And so all our ways of knowing God through humanity, which are the only ways we really have access to, because most of us don't have like, direct access to divinity, um, they're all male ways. And that's, they're limited by our culture. They're limited by a whole bunch of things. When we expand the definition of humanity to include women, we have access to many more ways of knowing God.
Mm-hmm.
And so when women say to themselves, I hunger for contact with the divine, I'm locked out by patriarchal religious traditions. So, but I know that's not all there is. I'm going to put myself in relation to the divine feminine. One of the radical things they're doing is they're saying, I'm fully human. And therefore, my life is as much a source of understanding of the divine and it has as much potential to be a place where God happens and a place where God is recognized as anybody else's life. So that I think is one way to the divine feminine. But that wasn't my way because, I never bought the God as male stuff. To me, that was, as a small child, it was just risible.
Mm.
If so, it was a hunger for something else. It was a
Yeah.
hunger for ways of knowing God, for aspects of God, for this sense of immanence, which is something I knew the word immanence, I've always liked big words. Um, but I just had never thought about it that way. And the way that I related to God's presence was not exactly like this. And I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know what I was missing. I just knew that I was hungry for it. So it didn't come out of a wound. It just came out of a sense of wanting more of a relationship with the divine.
Mm. Mm. Well, and one of the things that you said early on that I just find so fascinating is that, um, you were describing your feeling as a child of being different, being other, and that you didn't, well, and I want you to confirm this, but you didn't project that onto your understanding of God, which I think is so common. At least, I can talk about from my own experience. It
Mm.
becomes like, I am not worthy. I am different. And so therefore I am not worthy of love. And that gets projected onto divinity. God doesn't love me. I think, and I feel like you see that in conservative Christian traditions quite a lot, evangelical traditions, of people feeling completely rejected by God. And so I find it both beautiful and fascinating that that wasn't your experience. Even though you were experiencing this intense longing and not even wanting to be alive, it sounds like you weren't putting that on divinity rejecting you. Did I get that right?
Yes, you did. And it's a bit of a mystery. I mean, I think in some ways I wasn't dealt the best hand of cards. There was emotional abuse in my family, and there was the trans thing. But in this one way of having a sense of God's presence, I really hit the jackpot as a kid. And it was not because I earned it. I was not spiritually elevated or spiritually disciplined or fasting or praying. And, you know, I was at least as morally sucky as any of the other kids my age. Um, so it wasn't something that I deserved. It was something that God was just there. So I imagined, when I imagined what we now call coming out to people, I just imagined myself being seen as monstrous or unlovable,
Mm.
that people would not want to be with me. I didn't really have clear sense of it, but kids in my generation who came out as trans, sometimes they were experimented on, sometimes it's institutionalized, just like kids today. Many of them were beaten up by their parents, driven out of their homes, abused, stigmatized, homeless, whatever. There were not a lot of happy things. Mostly didn't know them. I just knew my family, and I thought they will see me, and they will not want to be with me, and neither will anyone else. But God was always there.
Mm.
God did know who I was, and God was always there. It wasn't even the word love, and love was hard for me because of the emotional abuse. I didn't know, and because of feeling trans. So on the one hand, that there was emotional abuse. So when love is mixed with hurt, it's hard to really learn the right stuff about what love is.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, because of being trans, I felt like even if you're loving me right now, you don't know who I am. You have no clue who's standing here. You wouldn't love me if you knew. So I think in some ways, the human ideas about love that were so messed up, they they didn't get projected easily onto God because the basic thing was presence and God was there. God was just
Mm.
not going away. And there was a problem because I couldn't imagine God's love. I did as a child. I would project all kinds of awful stuff. It's filled with self-hatred. I thought, the reason that, what was wrong with the universe was me, was a frequent voice in my head. But, so I would project that onto God, but God just didn't act that way.
Mm.
Because unlike the other people, God knew who I was and God just kept being there. I think if
Mm.
I'd had a healthy idea of love, I would have said, wow, God really loved me. But instead, it's just like, wow, you're really here. And to me, that was like, you must be lonely too.
Mm.
You know, and I do think that there is a divine loneliness in relation to creation, a wanting to be known that is represented in many different religious traditions, right?
Mm.
So that's a divine loneliness. And I thought, you're here with everybody and they don't see you, they don't know that you're with them. I know how that feels. I get that. And so we're kind of akin. So I wasn't capable of translating into God loves me, but it was more like we're two of a kind and we're shipwrecked outside of humanity, a humanity that we love.
Mm. Yeah, it sounds like that early understanding of God for you was what you call the Shekinah now. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, although it hadn't been separated into immanence and transcendence. So
Mm.
when I was writing the Shekhinah poems, I had to learn that the immanence, because I knew what immanence was. I had to learn through the poems that immanence was this form of transcendence, to get
Yeah. Yeah.
have that binary note. But when I was a kid, I knew that this being that was beyond time and space and humanity was there with me. So it wasn't like there was a conflict between transcendence and immanence. It made it very hard to relate to God. God is really not a fun playmate when you're a kid. Um, that's kind of how lonely I was. And when I had kids to play with, I wasn't saying, no, I don't want to, you know, do Hot Wheels cars now. I want to sit around and talk to God. I was not that kind of kid. Um, but so I was just there with something that was huge and beyond me and wouldn't go away and wanted to be there with me. It was immanence and transcendence, I guess, all at once, but really it was just God. And there was only one real word that I had for God. I mean, I use the word God all the time, but the only real word that I have for God is you. God was my you.
Mm. Well, and I notice when you say God that you don't say he or she. or I hear you say God, just God repeatedly. Um, can you talk about that? Like, again, I think it's natural, right? We relate to our own experiences, but for me, growing up in a Baptist household, God, it was just a given that that word meant He. That's just what it was. Um, and it seems like, at least in the way you talk about now, like even if we take our conversation about the Shekinah aside, like it seems there's a very intentional thing that you're doing of you're not saying God is he or she. And I wonder if you could speak to that. And is that an experience for you, or is that something that you feel like is inherent to Judaism?
Ah, good question. So again, I didn't grow up with people talking about God very much, so I was spiritually lonely also. But when I learned the language that people used about God, it was this masculinized language, which to me always was like, it was part of the pretending thing that I was doing, pretending to be male, pretending gender. It's like, God I'm hanging out with does not fit into this pronoun. So the blessing of growing up in spiritual isolation was that my relationship with God as I experienced God, was the basis for my understanding of God. And when I encountered other people's ideas that didn't fit that, I was like, yeah, that's not what's going on. I mean, it just never occurred to me to give up my own experience,
Mm,
which again, like I grew up believing that I couldn't be with, that nobody would accept me in the community if they really knew who I was. So
mm,
it's, there are reasons why people agree to dissolve their own experiences of the divine into a religious community, even when it's a hurtful one,
mm,
because there are good things about community and there are ways we can encounter God through and with other people in a community that are not possible alone. So part of my deal was I got one very good thing about relating to God, but not the other thing. Many people, it's more normal for people to get socialized into communities. And then you have to find your way through the crap that goes along with communities, because communities always mistake their human social stuff for sacred stuff. And then
mm,
you find your way through that to actual experiences of God. That's, but I had it the other way around, and I've never really gotten back to the community thing. My sense of community never developed. But when I was, for a long time, I would use male pronouns for God. And then at a certain point, I realized I'm out of the closet. I'm living as myself. I don't need to do this anymore. And in fact, I need to, I have an obligation to that witnessing of God. I have to find language, even though it's stylistically tedious. For a poet, that matters. But I have to find and model language that shows that we can have God without gender. We're not dependent. We don't lose God when we lose the heat.
mm,
At the same time, the Shekhinah taught me we do use gender metaphorically as ways to create rich, specific kinds of relationships with God that reveal different aspects of the divine. It's not that gendered language for God is a bad thing. It's just a bad thing when we conflate God with human gender. That's idolatry. God gets lost in gendered ideas.
mm. I,
And I don't want that.
yes, I'm so glad you said that, because the thing that's kind of been playing in my head, and I'm like, a lot of times I have these thoughts and I'm like, are they going to coalesce into a question, or are they just going to kind of float here? And if people have been listening to the show for a while, they'll know I sometimes ask messy questions, and it's just that I've got the thoughts and they're not quite coming out. But um, I was reflecting as you've been talking on one of the things that I feel like I have seen in this study and exploration of what I call the sacred feminine over the last several years is that for many women, I see it's a very empowering thing to find this aspect of divinity that they know in female form, and to see that that is a historical fact in many traditions, and also a very living thing in many traditions. If you look around now, you can You can find it. It's not like something that died 10,000 years ago. It's present. Hinduism is a great example. Any tradition coming out of Africa, another really good example. But what I see sometimes is that, and I will say I can recognize it because it's happened in myself. Okay, so I name it for myself too. A clinging to, now I know God, and God is really feminine, female, and only female. And so now I feel threatened when you talk about God as a he, and now I feel threatened by transgender people, perhaps, who might experience God as completely non-gendered or whatever. And that there's a locking in and a holding there. And what started out as perhaps a healing impulse, which is, I want to find myself as sacred. I want God to see me as sacred in this form that I was born in, and that, or not born in, I guess, but that I identify with. That there's a danger in getting stuck, like with my humanity being tied up to God's identity. And that's where this whole sort of messy thing, and maybe it doesn't have to be messy, but in my head it's messy, of immanence,
Yeah.
transcendence, like, all kind of tangling together. It gets tricky.
One of the things that you can see in the Hebrew Bible, and I don't know the New Testament hardly at all, but I believe it's there also, is that when God has relationships with human beings, when we're in relationship to God, those are human relationships. It's like when you relate to your cat, those are cat relationships. The cat will not relate to you on your terms. The cat can't do that.
A dog might try.
A dog might try, and yet the dog will never be invited to your podcast, although it unquestionably has experiences of the divine.
That's true. I will say my dog has, snored in the background of podcasts in the past, but he wasn't invited. Anyways, yes.
But
Yes.
our limitations mean that we can only relate to God in human terms, and God can only relate to us through human terms.
Yeah.
It also means, though, that our experience of human relationships can teach us a lot about our relationships with the divine. And one of the things that I know, that I think all of us know, is that when you attach to somebody, when you feel close to them, and often it's through gender that we do that. I would say that's the norm, right? When my
Yeah.
kids were born, I knew I was trans, but I totally related to them in terms of, oh, it's a boy, it's a girl, their whole lives, I could see them, just like
Yes.
anybody else. It was part of the intimacy. When my youngest transitioned, it was a shock
Mm.
to me because I had to then separate my relationship, my attachment to them from their gender. So one of the things about gendered relationships is they're ways of coming close to people, which heighten some aspects of that. They enable us to share certain things a lot, and they make it harder to share other things. But with all relationships that matter to us, I think there's anxiety. I think there's fear of being abandoned, of losing, and then we cling, right? So I know as a parent, I I wanted my kids to grow up. There were some early developmental issues. I never wanted my kids to stay little babies because I had a glimpse of what that might be like, and I didn't want that. But I also, it was heartbreaking to watch them change and grow away from me, which is exactly what they were supposed to do. And in
Yeah.
response to those anxieties, as they would remind me in no uncertain terms, I would cling to immature forms of them.
Mm.
And I think that we do the same with God because our relationships with God are human relationships. So when we feel close to God in certain terms, we mistake the terms that enable us or help us feel close to God for God's presence in our lives, for the divine, for our access to it. It's easy, it's normal.
Mm.
And they're also cozy. And I would say the same about my own, when I'm thinking, oh God, you're lonely like me, you're shipwrecked outside of humanity. You're doing the same thing. I'm taking my experience of gender and I'm turning it into a mode of relationship with God that says, through the idea of this shared relationship, I can feel close to you because in some way you're like me. And
Mhm.
I can know things about you which actually are aspects of God. Since,
Mhm.
God is so much, it's almost like you can't miss. Anything you've got in any term is going to give you something about God, but
Yes.
no terms will give you actually God. They
Mm.
only work. It's just like, windows don't give you what you're looking at, but they enable you to glimpse it. And they limit and they enable you. And that's what our terms and that's what our gender terms are. Do we need them? Well, I sure do. And I think the Shekhinah really taught me that, even if I hadn't known it before. So I do not want to diss anybody's gendered ways of relating to God. That's awesome. But if you start fearing or believing that God actually just fits inside those terms, you're losing God and replacing it with idolatry. And the advantage that idols have is they're stable. They stay right where you put them. They
Mhm.
never surprise you. They never scare you.
Yeah.
They just reflect back to you your own ideas. And we like our own ideas. I'll speak personally. I'm very happy to fall in love with my own ideas. And it bothers me every time God requires me to let go of my beloved conceptions
Mm.
and realize that there
Yeah.
is a largeness beyond.
Yes, I have said on the show before too to people that I feel like anytime I think I've got something fixed in my head, and I refer to her as she, it's
Yeah.
almost like she's got an invitation to be like, nope, I'm gonna pull the rug out from under you right now. Like, oh, are you comfortable? Let me take care of that for you. um, which
And
is a gift in a way. It's a challenging gift, but it is a gift.
it is a total gift. It's because of the reality of the divine presence. And it also shows that when we're afraid of losing God, if we let go of this or that way of relating to God or this and that term of God, what the Shekhinah keeps saying in these poems, and what I think the divine says in so many different ways, is ultimately it doesn't matter. My presence does not depend on your awareness. You would actually be stuck in a universe without God if my presence depended on your awareness. That's what secularism would have done. That's the nightmare of traditional religions. Often say we're afraid that secularism will create a universe that is emptied of the God that animates and orders our lives. No, God's like, you know, I'm not dependent on you that way. I'm not going away. And we
Mm.
do have a model of that. I had a kid with colic, a baby with colic. I was trying to finish my dissertation. And so I held a screaming child in one arm, typed with the other, and she would just scream for hours and hours and hours. And all I could do for her was show I'm not going away. I know it hurts. I can't do anything to stop it from hurting. I can't reach you or communicate because you're lost in this pain. But by golly, you are going to know that I'm here and I'm not going away. And that's what the Shekhinah is saying to us. However screwed up you may be, however confused or lost or anxious or angry or shamed, I'm here with you and I'm not going away.
Mm. There's something so beautifully, I don't know if this is the right word, but there's something so beautifully tragic about that to me. Like the idea that I'm looking at the windows here and that, I so desperately want to know God, and yet all I will know is this windowed view. There's something so heartbreakingly beautiful about that. I don't know any other way to say it. I could cry. I mean, it's just, it's a powerful, and that's the human experience, isn't it? I mean,
And to get back to your Hindu guess, that is the way that God grows through us because God can only be seen as each of us see God by each of
mhm,
us. It is our limitations and our particularities that enable God to be known and not known, lost and revealed in the particular ways we do. Without all of without our window frames
mm,
and our terms and our limitations, the particular way that we relate to God, that God gets to manifest through us, would not be possible. So God literally kind of grows in variegation, not in terms of oneness. The oneness of God doesn't change.
Yeah.
God isn't diminished by deaths, not increased by birth, but the richness. Like if you think about a brain, as our brains grow, they have more folds in them. You know, the physical shape of the brain reflects our experiences. That, right? It's kind of this oneness of God gets all of these folds and wrinkles and richness
Mm.
through the limited creatures, which I'm guessing, I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure if I were God, if I would have actually done the whole creation thing, but I'm guessing it's got to be one of the things that God likes about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
Huh. Would this
Um,
be, oh, go ahead, please. No,
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 go.
no, no,
No,
please, no, go ahead. I know I was just thinking about, who would God be without that never ending, uh, who, who would God be without that never ending cycle of creation that just seems to be endless? Like you could apply that to the universe, right? It's ever expanding. We know that. Who might God be? It sounds kind of boring without it, but what do I know? I'm not God. Would,
right.
you know?
Our metaphor from cosmology might be, the singularity that maybe was not beginning of all existence, but it seems to be the beginning of our existence. It's a state when there really is undifferentiated, there isn't even matter and energy. There's just,
Yeah.
it's so hot. It's just one thing and there are no structures. And then there's this journey outward, but held by gravitation. I had a cosmologist explain this to me, that enables this undifferentiated oneness to variegate. But it doesn't just turn into entropy, it doesn't just turn into dust, it turns into all of these structures because there is also the attraction, there's also the gravitation. So there's simultaneously an impulse toward absolute oneness, an impulse toward absolute expansion, which is also a form of oneness and emptiness, but an impulse toward variegation and structure,
Yeah.
relationship, difference. The things which give rise to what we think of as the wonders of our world and the wonders of one another. You don't get those without this kind of variegation. I was just
Mhm.
going to ask you if it might be time to read a poem.
Yes, I think it is. I've actually gone over time with you and I'm just so into this conversation. I don't know, Joy, maybe if it would bring you joy, maybe you might come back and come for a second round because I feel like I could talk to you for hours. So maybe some point down the road. Yeah. Okay. I think you said I would love that, but it cut out. Did you say that?
I said I would love
Okay, good.
that, and I would
Oh.
keep saying that.
Yes. Well, I would love to hear you read a poem from your book, Shekhinah Speaks.
So this is a poem called Your Body, and it relates to a lot of the wonderful questions that you were asking about. And I think questions that maybe all of us have is like, if God's here, what is God doing with us?
Yeah.
And what are we doing with God? And what does God get out of all this? Oh, is who we are getting in the way, or is it, whatever? So I've had particular issues with my body, so I took this one personally. The Isaiah chapter 66 in the epigraph is, Heaven is my throne and earth is my footstool. Where is the house you will build for me? Where will my resting place be? So some of the words came from that chapter, and some came from a Cosmo article called Inside the Scam of the Purity Movement.
Hmm.
Your body. You keep trying to escape the body I love, the blazing crush of physicality, impurity, and shame, separating you from yourself, from your soul, from me, the body I formed in your mother's womb, delivered, dandled, nursed, and comforted, the body that fails you in so many ways, through which you struggle to materialize, the way tomorrow struggles to materialize through today, blessing through pain, love through the flesh I made, to be a place where you and I can rest, hang out, go crazy for one another, marry, say goodbye, apologize, consume and burn like incense, can plead, pledge, proclaim, be held and protected, given and accepted, born and born again. It's me you feel moving inside you, my presence that's so hard to reconcile with your sexual nature and the nature of sex. Sometimes you feel violated, devoured. Tell yourself that you're no good. Imagine me demanding you preach gospels of fire, gospels of bone, gospels of coming to an end. I didn't make you to end. I made you a whirlwind of appetites and offerings I never stop wanting. Ceremony and sacrifice, wine and reckoning, comedy, coolness, birthing and healing, falling in love, romance, yes, and sex. Your body is a stream from which I drink, a hand I hold, a nipple I lick, a story I tell over and over, a Sabbath I keep for pleasure, a way of being alone, a way of being together, my choir, my throne, my crazy music, my dog-eared paperback.
Wow. I I hear her. I hear her. I mean, I don't know how to I don't know how to say it, but I feel that there is a voice of the sacred feminine that, I've heard in different ways and through different traditions and different experiences. And I hear her. I hear her in those words. I really do. It's so powerful. She has a voice. Yeah. And for me, I'm talking about there's a transcendent piece to that too. There's a big she, like a she that's bigger than just our own religious traditions or anything. And I hear her. I hear her in every one of your poems. It's just so special. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much for this conversation.
Yes, this is like food. This is just like the most delicious meal I could eat. That's how I feel. This is like nourishment for my soul. Thank you so much for your time and your um just your generosity of thoughts and reflections. I'm so grateful.
That gratitude is mutual.
Mhm. And please do come back if you'd like. I'd love to have you.
I would like, the day when you invite me back will be a happy day for my inbox.
Hooray. Okay, so wonderful. Well, and thank you to all of you for listening. As always, I'm so grateful. These conversations are so much more meaningful because somebody else is out there, receiving them. And, I mentioned at the beginning, but if you like the show, you can subscribe, you can tell your friends, you can leave it a favorable review. You can do all those things if it suits you. And until next time, take good care of yourself, and I will talk to you again soon.